When scapegoats escape inward to survive narcissistic abuse. You may have heard the saying that when you point a finger at someone else, that there are always three fingers pointing back at you. And I think there's certainly some wisdom in this for people who are overeager to blame others for their troubles. But for someone who survived narcissistic abuse as the scapegoat, I think that this saying and the concept that it reflects may sort of need to be overcome in the process of recovery. The scapegoat survivor has experienced the narcissistic parent and colluding family members to sort of relentlessly point their fingers at the survivor and then accuse that same person of, essential heresy if he or she dares to point a finger back in their direction. So the result for the survivor can be a sort of crippling of the reflex to fight back or protest when insulted and hold the person doing the insulting accountable. The scapegoat survivor has faced so much invalidation when they've tried to protest in this manner that they may have had to relinquish this instinct if they wanted to remain in the shared reality of the family. A reality that was very painful and unfair and blaming of the scapegoat, yet was better than having no reality to share with others. And if you were very young when this form of narcissistic abuse started, then you may have even come to associate the dismantling of your own anger or disagreement with others as a way of being close to them. And that would become by honestly, given how you were treated, most likely, by a narcissistic parent. Well, in today's video, I'm going to talk about the two-pronged process of change from this dynamic of self-crippling as a way to feel close to someone to being able to feel close to others while being fully possessed of yourself. I think it can often be a long road from the former to the latter, but obviously a very worthwhile one. And I'll address why asserting yourself in the process of recovery can still feel like you're doing something wrong or bad, even though you sort of know in your mind that you're right. Then I'll offer a few resources that can help with supporting yourself so that you can eventually know it's now safe to point your whole hand at offending others without indicting yourself at the same time. So obviously when you do this, all fingers are pointed in the same direction. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in helping people recover from narcissistic abuse. And this form of abuse can leave us feeling lost and estranged from our basic senses of who we actually are. And in individual therapy and through my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse, I try to offer a map that allows survivors to come back to a quality of life that they know deep inside themselves that they deserve. Of course, each survivor must travel this path themselves, but a map can be a tremendously important help with this process. And I see there being three features on the map that I'll call the three pillars to recovery. Pillar number one is making sense of what happened, so you know that it wasn't your fault. Pillar number two is gaining psychological, emotional, and perhaps physical distance from the narcissistic abuser. And pillar number three involves living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And lastly, you can't do this in a vacuum. I think it's essential to find and participate in communities that offer validation and support along this path. And for one example, the accompanying private Facebook group in my online course tries to serve exactly this purpose. Today's video falls under the playlist of pillar number three, living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And all videos on this channel are organized into one of these three playlists, which you can easily find. Another resource I'd like to point you to with regard to pillar number one of making sense of what happened so you know it wasn't your fault is also my free ebook on surviving narcissistic abuse as the scapegoat. You can find the link to the ebook in the description below or by clicking here. So, what does a child do when there's nobody to consistently connect to? A child needs a caregiving adult who's going to be consistently good to that child. And I don't mean perfectly good. In fact, infant parent researchers like Edward Tronick and Beatrice Beebe have found that the most securely attached infant-parent bonds happen when the parent is attuned to the infant about 33% of the time. Well, that obviously leaves a lot of room for the infant and the parent to miss each other and space for each party to attend to themselves. But what's critical is that there's an ongoing motivation and an intent on the part of the parent to be available to the infant. When this motivation and intent is in place, then the child gets to find a person outside of themselves upon whom they can depend, rely upon, and ultimately trust. By finding the source of what they need outside of themselves, there gets to be a sense of continuity with who others are to the child and who the child is to him or herself. And in those absences, or the other sort of 67% of the time, I think researchers and theoreticians would argue that's where this discovery can happen. Because, it's not as though the adult is constantly available, but they're discoverable time and time again. So just because the adult isn't there for the parent right now doesn't mean they won't return, because that's been the infant, toddler's repeated and repeated experience. But when a child does not get this, as is the case often for those born to a pathologically narcissistic parent, then he or she has to turn inward to find that connection they seek. In this psychologically tragic case, the child does not have a source outside of themselves consistent enough to count on, rely upon, nor trust. A narcissistic parent, for instance, will be more occupied with propping up their fragile yet inflated self-esteem in whatever seems to be working in that moment. And that's going to get in the way of being consistently available to their child. The child is not or cannot be an ongoing priority to a narcissistic parent, even at the 33% level. A narcissistic parent may take grave offense, for instance, at the child not smiling back when the parent smiles at them, and say decide to put that child down and leave the room until the kid learns his or her lesson. Or that same parent may want to stay on the phone with an adult friend because the parent feels his or her status is boosted, and sort of willingly ignore the child's pleas for the parent's attention. In these cases, the child learns that the parent's availability is highly volatile and can be directed towards others more than the child, just as easily as towards the child. The child doesn't have a person outside of themselves upon whom they can trust. Now the child has to turn from this painful external reality, given who the narcissistic parent is, towards an inner realm where they are freer to construct a world that is a little more friendly to them, but ultimately not as satisfying as the sort of real thing of having a useful external reality populated by real other people. So this inner realm can actually grow fairly elaborate in ways to protect the child from the pain of the narcissistic parent's unavailability. But most importantly, the inner realm is populated with other people, like the narcissistic parent, but in ways that seem much more satisfying and far less scary to the child. As the child's constructing this inner realm, they populate it with these internal others who are imbued with the qualities that the child wished they had, rather than the qualities they keep disappointingly showing to the child, they being the parents in this case. So the child sees their narcissistic parent as who the parent is in the child's inner realm, rather than how the parent actually is in the external realm. And this inner realm also requires delicate treatment of everyone in it in order to maintain the sort of fragile harmony that the child needs. So he or she must be very careful not to upset the narcissistic parent in the outside world, because that could result in disrupting this, again, fragile equilibrium in the child's inner world. In essence, the external world has to take a back seat to the child's inner world, because it's only in the inner world where the child finds anything approaching something comforting. The drawback being that it's not real and takes a lot of work to keep up. Well, as is so often the case when a child is abused or neglected, or both, the solution to that problem often creates new problems. And in this case, it's the child's turning away from a scary and unviable external relationship with the narcissistic parent, which results in a fantasized relationship to the internal other of that parent. But since that internal relationship isn't real, it's real fragile. No pun intended. As the external narcissistic parent goes on being withholding, domineering, or even attacking, the scapegoat child may seek to make these outside encounters be over with as fast as possible so the child can go back to their inner world where they feel less under siege and deprived. But a new problem is created because now the child cannot intervene effectively with what is going on outside of themselves. Their entire being screams to get back to their inner world when the external party starts being a problem. So the child's own reactions of anger and protest to this mistreatment have to get short-circuited because they could draw the child further out into the external world with the narcissistic parent, which is just not viable to the child. One of the ways the child might short-circuit their own anger or protest is to blame themselves when they get angry at the narcissistic parent. And this can happen in the blink of an eye. The child may simultaneously hate themselves while hating the parent in that moment for being unavailable or attacking of the child. So the child is very much pointing three fingers back at themselves when trying to point one at the parent. Doing so makes the whole endeavor of getting and showing anger, getting angry and showing it towards the parent to be just too fraught internally and externally to hang on to and feel like a resource to the child. Well, from the outside looking in, it can almost seem like the scapegoat child is surrendering to the parent or backing down from a fight. But this is not the case, I think, from the standpoint of the child's inner world. The child is simply wanting to get back to a realm where their internal others make sense and things feel way less dangerous and impossible. They've already tragically learned that nothing good happens in the external dimension with someone, an actual someone else, including conflict resolution, so it's best to go inward where things feel less unfixable. The parent gets to then have his or her way, but the scapegoat child no longer sees the external world as a viable battleground or where things get fixed. Well, how might this affect the scapegoat survivor as an adult? If you resonate with having had to turn inward to find a livable reality, then you may believe that you are unassertive by nature, or you may even, I would say, misinterpret yourself as being a coward in the face of conflict. In addition, there can be a lurking sense that other people sense this sort of aversion to conflict and see you as a scapegoat survivor as weak or unwilling to stand up for yourself. Well, first I want to say that this sense of being unassertive is often unfounded in the scapegoat survivor's external reality. Many such survivors that I've had the privilege of working with have no trouble standing up for others and at times themselves, but this may often happen in the heat of the moment. Then the stories that the person tells themselves and often believe quite fervently about what they did do don't include recognition for how they acted assertively. So my point is not that it's not that the scapegoat survivor fears to stand up to others, but that doing so can be a departure from the inner world and a lot of psychic structure that may exist designed to get the survivor back to that inner world. And that structure could be reflected in the narratives which the scapegoat survivor may tell themselves and readily believe that they don't have what it takes supposedly to stand up to others. The other thing I want to say about this common impression about oneself is that others tend to be far less attuned to this supposed fear of conflict in the scapegoat survivor. And many such survivors have a presence that evokes a sense of respect and in a, I think, healthy way conveys that they are not someone to be messed with. But this type of information about who the scapegoat is to others in the real external world is often very unfamiliar and even incoherent to the scapegoat survivor as a result of having had to pay so much more attention to their inner world. So they often lose a sense of who they are, how they appear out here. But, of course, from where life gets lived, the inner experience of the scapegoat survivor, the legacy of having to go into one's internal world to avoid danger, rather than mix in with the external world, can certainly leave that person feeling sort of foundationless when conflict arises, between oneself and someone in the external world. And in this case, the survivor may do whatever they can, as they had to with the narcissistic parent earlier in life, to make such conflictual situations just get over with. So that point is well taken. Well, what can be done? I think the goal in recovery is to have a balanced mix of both internal and external worlds. And when you have the fortune of good enough parents who were responsive and protective towards you, then the external world generally seems like a welcoming place that cares about what makes you happy, angry, sad, and so on. And you get to live in your inner world as a place to reside rather than as a substitution for external reality. The point is that it was and continues to be safe relationships that allow such a balance to develop. And if you had to burrow yourself into your internal reality in order to save yourself from an external reality with a narcissistically abusive parent who was too loveless and cruel to connect to, then new safe relationships will likely play an important role in making and finding friends in the external world today and finding that balance. So towards that end, I think it's crucial to know how to identify the qualities that can let you feel emotionally and psychologically safe with certain other people. I've created an online course that I mentioned earlier on recovery from narcissistic abuse that has 7 video modules, over 4 hours of original content. And in module 4, I focus on just this part of recovery, and that is how to find and cultivate relationships with people who can offer you this form of psychological and emotional safety. This module empowers the scapegoat survivor to shift from asking whether he or she is acceptable to others to the question of which others does the survivor find acceptable to him or her. So evaluating the character of other people is something that's often unfamiliar for the scapegoat survivor, but can make venturing back into the external world feel like a much safer endeavor than it used to. So making this shift in perspective can allow the scapegoat survivor to then eventually populate their external world with actual people who treat that survivor well more times than not. And then when things maybe go awry with this sort of, these sort of correctly selected people, there's going to be an opportunity to repair what went wrong together. So, in essence, back to that 33%, attunement rule of thumb, with good, safe other people, it doesn't mean everything's going to feel good all the time. But when there are disruptions in the relationship, they can be addressed collaboratively with the other person. One can be vulnerable in how they felt or what they liked or didn't like about how they were treated, and be received with respect and a willingness to change in order to make the relationship work. If you're interested, you can find more information on the course and this module by either clicking here or finding the link in the description box below. Well, again, thank you for tuning in this week. I hope you found this video helpful, and want to thank everyone for your continued engagement with the channel and the videos and with each other. The support, validation, and encouragement that gets shared. I know I sound like a broken record, but it's awesome. I would say keep it up, but I'm sure that's already happening. So I just want to recognize it, tell you how much I appreciate it, and I think it's widely appreciated. And with that, I'll see you all next week. New videos, Friday, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take care.